Welcome back to our Sunday School series on the book of Hebrews. This is lesson number 16. Hebrews 12:18 through 13:6, a call to persevere in the faith, part 4. So let's turn to chapter 12, starting in verse 18, and we'll read all the way through verse 6 of chapter 13. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? All right. Good stuff. So let's start. The way I've got this broken down is verses 18 through 24 is where he's going to continue with this theme, Old Covenant versus New Covenant. And he's going to do so via a comparison of an Old Covenant mountain and a New Covenant mountain. And so it's interesting to see him do this. But let's make one note before we look at this comparison. What's the point of him saying this at the beginning, what may be touched, in verse 18? He says, for you have not come to what may be touched. What's the point of this phrase? It's spiritual, right? So he's going to make a comparison between a physical mountain, a physical reality, and a spiritual reality. And so this idea of you have not come to what may be touched is they could go and touch Mount Sinai, right? And feel that and see that and all that kind of stuff. But what he's doing is continuing with a theme that he has already introduced in chapter 11. So look back at verse 10 of chapter 11, and then we'll look at verses 13 to 16 just to be reminded of what he's doing here by saying, you've not come to what may be touched. So in chapter 11, this is the faith chapter. If you look at verse 10, when he's talking about Abraham, he says, for Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham was told to go to a place where he would be showed that's the promised land. He got up and went, not knowing where he was going. But he was not looking forward only to that land. He was looking forward to that, what that land prefigured and pointed forward to, which was the heavenly, spiritual, eternal reality. Not just an earthly, physical reality. Now look down at verse 13. said, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." All right, so here he's saying, I'm going to make this comparison to an old covenant reality and a new covenant reality, an earthly reality versus a heavenly reality. And that's where the comparison's going right here. So he's going to compare Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. And again, he's using the idea of earthly here, spiritual here. So let's take a look at some of the comparison he makes between these two mountains, which represent the Old Covenant, New Covenant. He says in verse 18 that what may be touched, that is Mount Sinai, was a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. All right, so he's referencing a specific scene from the Old Testament. What scene is it? Where is he taking us?
Exodus.
Okay, yeah, it's to Exodus. Immediately before God gives the law, the Ten Commandments, right? And so if you go and look at Exodus 19 and into Exodus 20, this is exactly the scene that he's talking about. Moses goes up on the mountain to meet with God, and Moses tells everybody, don't come on the mountain. Anybody who comes to the mountain or touches it, man or beast, is to be killed. And that's the reference he's making here to they couldn't even endure the command that not even a beast can touch the mountain or it will be killed. And all of the things that he mentions here, they see happen on the mountain. They see the blazing fire. They see the darkness and gloom and tempest, the storm on the mountain. And the sound of the trumpet they hear, that's a heavenly trumpet. That's not just the Israelites blowing a trumpet. And the voice they hear is God's voice. And they beg that don't let this voice speak to us anymore. And so what they actually end up doing is saying, Moses, you be a mediator for us. You be the go-between between God and us, because we're not interested in hearing this anymore. The point is that what does this scene paint? Fear. That's exactly right. Yeah, this scene is a fearful scene, and the people were afraid, and rightly so, that God was demonstrating His authority and His power, His holiness, and what they saw in contrast to that was their own weakness and sinfulness, which was, I would argue, not just the noise and the sight was fearful, but to be in the presence of the holy God and realize your sinfulness, that is fearful. And that's where the author will take us a couple of times here at the end of the book as well. So we have Mount Sinai, which is Old Covenant, is one that's described as fearful. Now, in contrast to this, well, let me ask one question before we move on. In Exodus 19 and 20, where were they going at that point in the history? Where were the Israelites going? Yeah, okay, they're going to the Promised Land. Okay, keep that in mind, that they're on their way out of slavery through the wilderness to the Promised Land. That's the trajectory they're headed. Now you can see what he's already been doing in the book is to draw the Old Testament pointing forward to the New Covenant. The same is going to be true as he makes the comparison here. Out of slavery through the wilderness to the Promised Land is where we're going also, but it's not to the physical Promised Land, it's to the spiritual Promised Land here. So look at what he does with Mount Zion in verses 22 through 24. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Right? So that's where the Israelites were headed, was to Jerusalem, the capital of the Promised Land, physical. But he said, no, you're not headed there. You're headed to the heavenly Jerusalem. And to innumerable angels in festal gathering. Okay, so here is what's going on. You have come to the city. And notice he says you're not going to the city. He says you have come. to the heavenly Jerusalem. And so this is the idea that the new covenant has broken in, right? The kingdom of God has already broken into this physical world. When Christ came, that's exactly what he says. The kingdom is at hand. And he demonstrated it by casting out demons, by raising the dead, by healing the sick. Look, it's here. It's not here in its fullness, but it's here. And he says, you have come to the heavenly Jerusalem. And so we have a foretaste of that. And we're joining in this huge assembly, which he's already kind of drawn the picture of in chapter 11. But the assembly that we join is made up of innumerable angels in festal gathering. What's festal gathering? What is that?
Party.
Yeah, it's a party. It's a big feast. There's a big celebration that is happening. The angels are there. They've got their nicest clothes on, getting ready to get jiggy with it. So they're there to celebrate. But that's not just the angels. In verse 23, it's the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Who's that? It's the believers, right? So we think about in the Old Testament, when the firstborn was born, they were dedicated to God, right? And they were dedicated to God to serve God. But what happened was the Levites would serve in their place. That was the Levites' role. They would serve in the place of the firstborn. And so we are seen as firstborns. All of us who are regenerated and brought into the kingdom, we're like the firstborn son, gathered together to assemble in the throne room of heaven. We've come to the angels, we've come to the saints, we've come to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. All right, so you can see what we've got here is the throne room of heaven, and everybody is gathered. Everybody is gathered for this huge celebration that the new covenant, while it has already broken in here and now, as he writes to the audience, this is the ultimate culmination of the promises, of all of the promises that were made in Christ in the new covenant. Now he says that we've come to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. That's obviously Christ's blood, right? But what word does Abel's blood speak?
Cries out.
Okay, cries out what?
Revenge.
Okay, right. So in one sense we see, and that's what Genesis tells us, right? God comes to Cain and says, where's your brother? His blood cries out to me, right? So in one sense, Abel's blood cries out for revenge, but Christ's blood cries out for forgiveness. So we see a distinction there. Now, Abel's blood also is mentioned in chapter 11, or his voice is also mentioned in chapter 11. If you look at verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. So Abel's blood still speaks, and it speaks of righteousness and faith. So we see Abel's blood speaking of revenge. We also see it speaking of righteousness and faith, but Christ's blood is speaking of an even better word than that, right? Christ's righteousness above Abel's righteousness. Christ's faithfulness above Abel's faithfulness. So there's this multifaceted way in which the sprinkled blood that we have come to speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So that sounds like the kind of city I want to be in, right? That's the place I want to be going, is this great celebration and gathering of the throne room of heaven. So he sets us up here this one final time. And here I would say that this is, all right? That's, if you're just bottom lining what's going on here, this is it. Old covenant, new covenant, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, earthly, spiritual, fearful, joyful. And so he ties up neatly this idea of comparing the old covenant and the new covenant in the book of Hebrews here. But where do we go next? He's going to hit, for the third time at least, a warning against apostasy. Right? So you remember the audience, Jewish Christians who are in danger of falling back into some form of Judaism because there's persecution that's breaking out against them in some ways. And so he says in verse 25, begins to warn against apostasy one last time. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. And he's going to make this argument, which he has used before. He's used this argumentative method to go from the lesser to the greater. And he does it here. He says, see that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, so that's the lesser, how much more so if we refuse him who warns us from heaven? And let's make a few notes here. There's some interesting language being used. The word refuse, does anybody have a different translation than refuse in verse 25? See that you do not refuse. This word is used in verse 19. In verse 19, in the ESV, it's the word beg. Okay? So what does this word mean that it can be used in both of these instances? So look in verse 19, it says, they heard a voice who made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. The idea is that they are excusing themselves from the scene, right? We don't want to hear this anymore. I'm going to excuse myself. They're begging, no more, and they take themselves out of the scene. Okay? So that's the same idea that's being spoken about here. See that you do not beg or excuse yourself or refuse him who is speaking, right? So he's telling the hearers, that's what he's concerned about them doing. They're excusing themselves from the scene because persecution has broken out. It's hard. He said, don't do that. See that you don't refuse him who is speaking. All right? Because if you refuse him who is speaking, he warned or spoke to them on earth, and they were in danger. They did not escape. So much more so will we be held accountable if we reject or refuse him who warns us from heaven. So there's this, again, distinction between the earthly and heavenly, or between the physical and the spiritual. That's going on here as well. Now he says after verse 25, at that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Okay, let's talk about this first. We're going to go to an Old Testament passage because he's quoting from a specific passage that we need to go and look at. But the scene is, verse 26, at that time his voice shook the earth. What time is it? Is he talking about when his voice shook the earth?
Mount Sinai.
Yeah, at Mount Sinai. At that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Where is this passage coming from? It's coming from the prophet Haggai. So here's a test to see if you can find where Haggai is in the Old Testament. I'll give you a hint. It's one of the last three books, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So turn to Haggai chapter 2. Haggai is only 2 chapters. There's only 2 pages in my Bible. And he's quoting from verse 6, but we'll read verses 1 through 9. And you'll get a good context about why he chooses to go here. Why does he pull this passage? It's kind of random, it seems, in some ways. But as you go here and read it, it'll make sense. Haggai chapter 2, we'll read the first 9 verses. Let's see. Let me give you some context before we read. Number 1, Haggai is a prophet to Jerusalem after the Jews have returned from exile in Babylon. They're back in Jerusalem. And so he's ministering sometime, if you're interested in a time frame, it's somewhere between 538 and 515 BC, where Haggai ministers as a prophet to Jerusalem. The Jews have come back from exile from Babylon to Jerusalem, and they're rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. What are they supposed to rebuild first? The temple. They're not rebuilding the temple. So part of Haggai's ministry is to say, start rebuilding the temple again. They've laid the foundation, but they kind of stopped and started doing their own thing, building their own homes and making sure they were taken care of. And so he's calling them back to build the temple. And so let's read at verse 1 of chapter 2, and this will begin to make sense. In the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to all the remnant of the people, and say, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? What house is he talking about? The house of the Lord, right? The temple, right? He's asking, all you who are here, does anybody remember what the old temple looked like? And he says, how do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? Right? They saw it. The new temple they were building was nothing compared to Solomon's temple. It was like nothing to them. And even worse than that, all they had done is laid the foundation at this point. So it really was nothing, literally speaking. And so they see the new temple, and you'll read in other prophets where they actually kind of weep when they see the new temple because of how little it is in comparison to Solomon's temple. In verse 4, yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt. All right, sound familiar? In Hebrews chapter 12, he's referencing that. My spirit remains in your midst, fear not. And here's the quote, for thus says the Lord of hosts, yet once more in a little while I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord of hosts. The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts. Okay, so let's unpack what Haggai's doing here. The Jews have come back from Babylon. They're rebuilding the temple. They see that it's nothing compared to the old temple. Haggai's telling them to rebuild it anyways. But he uses language about God shaking not just the earth like he did at Sinai, but shaking the heavens and the earth, the sea, the dry land, everything. So that when he shakes it, all nations will be shaken, and the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory. So what Haggai's doing is he's looking past the second temple to the heavenly city, to the eternal Jerusalem. Exactly what the author of Hebrews is talking about is what Haggai is talking about here, only 600 years earlier, right? So he's using the picture of the temple as a figure that will be fulfilled ultimately in the heavenly Jerusalem. So he says things like this, which would show you that he's not talking about the earthly reality. He's talking about a future spiritual reality when he says things like this. In verse 9, the latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts, and in this place I will give peace. The latter glory of the house that you're building, which is nothing, is going to be greater than Solomon's glory and his temple. That's not the case. He knows that's not the case, physically speaking. The temple's smaller. It's not as impressive. It's not as wealthy. It's not what Solomon's temple was. So how can it be the case that this latter temple is greater in glory than the former? And the answer is he's looking forward to the heavenly Jerusalem. And it's in the heavenly Jerusalem where we see things like this. He shakes everything, as the author of the Hebrews says, he shakes everything so that the things which are created fall away, and the things which are spiritual remain. The things which are eternal remain. So the things which are created, which are of nothing, they fall away, and the things which are eternal remain and continue. Those things are brought into this heavenly city, this heavenly Jerusalem. So that includes things that you are bringing in. Things that you bring into the heavenly Jerusalem. That God has worked in you. He has given you as gifts that you have developed and grown and used in your own life. You bring that into the kingdom. That's part of the reason there's a big party going on, right? Here comes Jim, here comes Cookie, here comes Shelly. They're coming, they're bringing what they have brought, their treasures, into the kingdom. They're bringing it into the heavenly Jerusalem. And so that's part of the reason the author of the Hebrews goes to Haggai here, because this idea of a heavenly city to which we are looking forward to is not something that he came up with. This has been something looked forward to even in the Old Covenant, which is the argument he made earlier in the letter. Because we look back at the Old Covenant and they realized there was a new covenant coming that was better than the one that they already had. And so they look forward to the new covenant even back here in Haggai as they return from the exile in Babylon. Okay, so does that make sense? You see where he's getting this idea of the future heavenly Jerusalem from. Okay, let's go back to Hebrews. So here, again, what he's done is he's given us a last little gasp of theology, we'll say, before he really goes into some practical application then, right? The old covenant is lesser than the new covenant. We have a heavenly future city that is greater than the earthly cities to which they pointed. And now, in verse 28, he begins to apply what he's been saying. He answers the so what. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, right? The kingdom that we inherit, the city to which we are going, the heavenly Jerusalem is one that's not shaken or done away with. It's eternal and heavenly spiritual reality. And says we should be grateful for that. That's the first application here. In verse 28, he's going to have a couple applications. Number one is to be grateful. And in the Greek, it actually says something kind of like this. Let us, in grace, receive that which cannot be shaken. Let us, in grace, receive that which cannot be shaken. Something to that effect where it uses the word grace, not the word grateful. But the idea is that we are receiving the kingdom gracefully or thankfully or with thanksgiving. So number one is that we should be grateful. Now this should cause you then to align your priorities in this life with that which cannot be shaken. Right? That's a practical application of it. Is not to be consumed with the things of this world and of this life, but our priorities and our alignment should be then towards the heavenly Jerusalem, the new kingdom, and aligning ourselves there. So when he says we should be grateful for the kingdom which we receive, which cannot be shaken, that's where we want to align ourselves in the way that we live our lives and the things that we pursue and the way that we teach our children and grandchildren and our spouses. That's where we're headed. That's where we're aligning ourselves. Now the second application he makes is to let us offer to God acceptable worship. Now this is an interesting phrase because if somebody has an NIV or a King James or something different, read us what it says. It says, I'll read the ESV. Let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. Does anybody? Acceptable service? Service?
Serve God.
Okay, so let us serve God. Anything different than reverence and awe?
Godly fear.
Godly fear. Okay, good. So the point is they're trying to capture what's being said in the Greek here in these different ways. So there's a few key words to understand here. First, this word acceptable is the idea of well-pleasing. To do something in a manner that is pleasing to God. Right? That's the idea of acceptable. Something that is pleasing to God. The next word which you hit on is this word worship. Literally, it's the word service. So let us serve God in a manner that is pleasing to Him. This would be a more literal translation of the words here. And so this word is translated most often in the New Testament as exactly this, but it's service in relation to the worship of God. So service in the temple, service in the tabernacle, service by the priests. That's what kind of service is being talked about here. That's why it can be translated as worship, because it's service in the worship of God. Makes sense? So, since we are inheriting a kingdom that cannot be shaken, that we come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, whose sprinkled blood speaks a better word than Abel, we should be grateful and we should offer acceptable worship to Him, a service that is well-pleasing. The way you do this, how do you offer well-pleasing worship, is to do so with reverence and awe. This is the language of the ESV. This word is the word that is literally, it means fear. And it means fear in the sense of terrifying fear. It's translated godly fear because that is what is being spoken about here. But the word itself, when it's translated elsewhere in the New Testament, is translated as, I'm terrified in fear. But it's the kind of fear that we talk about in worship that is reverent and awful with this type of emphasis on it. And so the point of this word comes in the next phrase, in the next verse, because our God is a consuming fire. Now, there's an implicit application being made here by saying that God is a consuming fire. Is God a consuming fire to His children? No, He's not. So what's being implied by saying this and ending here? What's being implied is the idea, remember we're in a little section where He's warning against apostasy. He's warning against falling away. The point is, if you are not doing this, then you stand before God here. Right? If you're not offering acceptable worship to God, if that's not the trajectory you're on, if you're not grateful for the heavenly Jerusalem, then where you stand before God is He is a consuming fire. And you ought to be afraid if you stand before God who is a consuming fire. Now, He's used this language before elsewhere in Hebrews, where in the same type of passage where He's warning against apostasy. And He refers to God as a fury of fire, as a judge before whom you will stand. And this is one last warning He's giving. This ought to describe your life. That you live a life of thanksgiving, that you live a life of worship, of acceptable, well-pleasing service to God. If that doesn't describe you, then you should be afraid because you stand before God who is a consuming fire. So this is His final warning against apostasy now. All good stuff. So let's continue with this application, because we're going to move now into chapter 13 as he continues with, as we've said before, some lettuce, some salad he's going to make here. He's going to use some let us commands to practically apply what he's been theologically explaining over the last 12 chapters. So what you'll see in verses 1 through 6 is that there are 4 pairs of commands. So what will happen in the next 6 verses is there's one command and then there's a second command that further explains the first one. There's a command, a second one follows it, which amplifies what he's saying. So here's command number 1. Let brotherly love continue. Anybody know what this word is? Keep going. It's even more than that. This is 2 words here. It's phileo, but it's got something else on it. It's this word. It's one word. It's a compound word. We have a city name. Philadelphia. That's exactly what it is in Greek. Let Philadelphia continue. So, this says a few things about the audience. They are doing it. So there's an encouragement here to keep doing what you're doing. You're doing something good. So keep Philadelphia-ing each other. Love each other. Let that continue. Now here's the amplification of this for the second command. Let's say this is 1a. Do not neglect to show hospitality. All right, so you can see how this amplifies this command here, right? So it's a more specific command. Now, there's some interesting language that's going on here. This word hospitality
in the Greek is this word, philoxenia. So here's love. Anybody? Strangers. Yeah, right? So do not neglect, and this is a verb, or a noun, excuse me. Do not neglect stranger love is what's going on here. Do not neglect to continue to love strangers. And he says there's like an encouragement here about why you ought to love strangers. And he says, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Now, one other note, and then we'll talk about this in a second. Here's the Greek. You see the connection? This word strangers is wrapped up in this word entertain. So to entertain or to show hospitality, right, is to love strangers or to love sojourners, to love the exile, the alien. Now, what's going on here that he says that some have entertained angels without knowing it? There's a couple of things that could be happening, so throw out some ideas.
Actual angels.
Okay, maybe actual angels, right? Can you think of an example where that's happened?
Abraham.
Abraham, right? Yeah. So we have some Old Testament examples of this actually happening, right? Now, based on what he's done already in chapter 11 and throughout the rest of the book, maybe he's pointing back to that picture to say it's possible that there are angels that are walking around, and by loving the stranger, you entertain them the same way that Abraham and the others did. That's a possibility. The other possibility is the word angels. It means messenger. And so, possibly, I think the first one is probably what's going on. But this is a possibility as well, that what they're saying is that as you entertain strangers, it's possible that you're entertaining messengers and you don't know. These messengers would have been traveling missionaries, traveling pastors, itinerant pastors moving throughout the land. And by showing hospitality and brotherly love, you're entertaining these folks without knowing that that's who they are and that's what they're doing. Proclaiming the gospel, spreading the kingdom, bringing others into it. It's possible that that's what's going on. But I think the first one is more likely what's happening, what he's saying here. But both are possible here. So the first command, let brotherly love continue. There's a second command that's backing this one up. Don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers. Now think about the audience for a second. What's going on in their life? They've just lost property. They've just lost possessions. They've been publicly humiliated. Probably don't want to entertain anybody. They're probably not interested in hosting strangers in their house. But the author's telling them, don't neglect to do that, even though you're suffering the way that you're suffering. Don't let that fall by the wayside. Okay? That's command number 1. Command number 2. What you will see in these 4 commands is that they do largely apply to the church, to fellow believers. Now, by application, can you extend that outside? Of course. By application, you can do that. By explanation, these largely apply to fellow believers. Now, here's command number 2 in verse 3. Remember those who are in prison. Now, remember the audience. Who are those in prison? Yeah, it's the church who's been persecuted. And they're saying, don't forget about your brothers and sisters who are in prison for Christ's sake. Now, Paul, in some of his letters, mentions how encouraging it was that somebody came to visit him in prison, that he was not forgotten in his chains. But Timothy and others actually took the time to visit him in prison. And so the author here is saying the same thing. Remember those who are in prison, and he says, remember them as though in prison with them. And the word, let's see, which word is it? It says, as though in prison with them, actually is translated, if you translate it literally, it'd be this. Remember those in prison as bound together with them. So the idea is they're in chains and you're shackled right next to them. And that's how you ought to remember them while they're in prison. As though you're sitting there shackled next to them. That's the kind of emphasis he's given to this command. Don't just let them be off out of sight, out of mind. But just as though you're sitting there next to them in chains, you ought to remember them. Now, if you look back at chapter 10, verse 33... this gives you the context into which he's writing. Verse 33, sometimes you were being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and abiding one. So again, they're doing it. They're doing it. They're remembering those who are in prison. And it says that sometimes you are being partners with those so treated. Which, if you remember, we talked about literally, it means you are passing through it with them. Which is basically the same thing he's saying here in chapter 12 or 13. Remember those in prison as though you're bound and shackled next to them. That's how you pass through it with them, is to remember them in that way. So the amplifying command here is to remember, at the end of verse 3, remember those who are mistreated. This is to remember those mistreated. And since you also are in the body. All right? Now, this word is used only one other time in Hebrews, mistreated, and it's used of the prophets at the end of chapter 11. So if you go look at the end of the chapter 11, and it talks about they were mistreated, they were sawn in two, and that whole list of things that happened to the prophets, that's the same thing that's happening to the believers in their own time. That they're experiencing that same kind of suffering. So remember them, because you're in the body too. So here is an explicit explanation of this command, that this is to remember the believers who are being mistreated for Christ's sake, who are in prison for Christ's sake. That's the second command. Now, of course, by application, we can expand this to other prisoners and that sort of thing, but the primary explanation is to remember the believers who are in prison. And so prison ministries help accomplish that, both for those who are in prison for Christ's sake, and then prisoners who are believers. They're not incarcerated for Christ's sake, but they're in prison, and they're still being ministered to because of the love of the body for them. So that's an application of this passage as well. Third command, in verse 4, let marriage be held in honor. And the ESV says, among all. And the idea here, in the Greek it says, this is the unpretty English version, honorable, let marriage be in all. So the emphasis may be on let everybody view marriage as something honorable. Or it could be your marriage needs to be honorable. And the second command amplifies how do you make your marriage honorable? And it says, let the marriage bed be undefiled. All right, it's verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. All right? So again, the emphasis is upon this application that my marriage with Susanna, your marriage with your spouse is to be held in honor. And how do I do that? I make sure the marriage bed is undefiled so that there's no sexual immorality or adultery that's taking place in our relationship. And by application, as we look at the seventh commandment, you can move that in all sorts of directions, right? Pornography, infidelity, homosexuality. You can take that in many different applications of how to keep the marriage bed undefiled. So this is the third command. Now what's interesting is he's mentioned briefly here and there the idea of sexual immorality. He mentions it with Esau. Don't let anybody be sexually immoral or ungodly like Esau. And he mentions it in passing one or two other places. So apparently there must be this struggle for this body of believers, that there's some, at least temptation to sexual immorality in the context where they are. And so here again is another admonition for them to remain sexually pure. Fourth command, final command in this series. Verse 5, keep your life free from love of money. All right, and now how does he amplify this? Now this is a challenge for us. We live in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, and we still struggle with the love of money. We have more money than anybody in the history of the world, and we're still consumed with the love of money. That's a serious problem. This is a real application for us in this context as well. And if you remember the audience to whom he's writing, we talked about at the very beginning, it could be that he's writing to Rome. And if he's writing to a body of believers in Rome, Jewish Christians who are in Rome, well, Rome is much like modern America in the ancient world, right? Wealth, opulence that you can imagine. So maybe if that is the audience to whom he's writing, this makes sense. Keep yourself free from the love of money and be content with what you have. And that's the amplifying command. Be content. And this is the Greek. It says, be content with the present. Well, what's their present? They just lost property. They just lost possessions. They're publicly humiliated. Some of them are in prison. And you be content with that. That's what he's saying. Don't be consumed with the love of money, but be content with the present. Wherever you are right now this morning, he's saying be content. And why can you be content with that? There's this incredible promise that follows, because he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. He's already made that promise to us in this book already. And he's bringing it back up again here at the end. You can be content with where you are right now this morning, because God has promised he's not going to leave you and he's not going to forsake you. He's with you. He's got you. And so he says we can confidently say from the Psalms, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? What can man do to them? Take their possessions, take their property, publicly humiliate them, throw them in prison. Be content, because God is with you, even in the midst of that. He's not going to leave you, and he's not going to forsake you. So a great promise he gives the believers, the readers of the book of Hebrews, and he gives to all of us. No matter where you are this morning, you can be content because God is with you, and he's not going to leave you. You've been listening to lesson number 16 in our Sunday School series on the book of Hebrews, a call to persevere in the faith, part 4, chapter 12, verse 18 through 13:6.